Lisa Schnebly Heidinger is celebrating Arizona with lots of interesting people, so you'll hear wonderful voices with new stories. Grab your favorite drink and settle in. We're celebrating Arizona, going everywhere from A to Z, and we're off.
Welcome to Celebrating Arizona. I have a special guest today, a gentleman I've known almost my whole life, who has maybe more stories per capita than anybody else I know. And we're going to be focusing today on radio. Ray Lindstrom, welcome.
Well, hi, Lisa. It's great to be here. It really is.
Thank you for coming. My goodness. You are a repository?
I've known you since you were 3 years old. You understand that, don't you? You've aged well.
Well, thank you. You probably remember that a little bit better than I do. Yeah, because you were at K-Gun when my dad was.
That's right.
And you did television, radio, and radio today is kind of what we're going to focus on. And your record label, too. Got to talk about
Oh,
that.
boy, I forgot about that.
Oh, don't ever forget about the record label. It's too good. So you were at Catalina High School when you started in the business.
That's right. And myself and a fellow by the name of Bert Schneider, we were good friends, and all we wanted to do was be on the radio. And we got our first opportunity when we were 15 years old, and there was this new FM station in town, KTKT FM 99.5, the only FM station in town, and nobody had FM radios, hardly at all. My parents, in order to listen to me, had to go out and buy an FM radio. And boy, I was awful. And, we weren't being paid. This was a voluntary job. And we were so bad, we weren't being paid, and we were afraid of getting fired. This was it. And, I didn't know any of these names. Here was a song by Wagner. And then a woman would call up and she would say, "Young man, it's not Wagner, it's Wagner." And I said, "Well, it's got a W, not a V on there. I don't understand that." Or we have now, let's have Pablo Castles play his cello. Those, I didn't know anything about this. It was just terrible. But it was our first experience, and it was free.
And you didn't have a phone you could look everything up on in those days.
That's right, exactly. The second thing, I was in television in 1958, and when I turned 16, then I could get a legitimate job that actually paid money, and I was a prop boy at Channel 13. That was the title of that job, was to set up props, because everything was live. There was no videotape in those days. So if you had an announcer and he was advertising for a cookie sponsor, you had to set up the cookies and set up the art cards or whatever was there for the announcer. That was my job. I was making $1 an hour doing that. And so but I was in show business, and I learned how to work the boom mic and everything else. Beginning of television, we were all experimenting and just having a lot of fun, that's all.
Wow. So television and radio were kind of side by side. And a lot of anniversaries right now. The country is 250. Route 66 is 100.
That's right.
And Tucson Radio is 100?
Well, there's one other thing that's 100. Could I mention that to you?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing that's 100 is that this fall, it was 100 years ago that John Button Salmon of the University of Arizona football team was in a terrible accident. And on his deathbed, he whispered to the coach, "Tell the team to bear down." And so that's where we got our bear down thing. Now imagine if he would have said something else. What if he would have said, "Tell the team to beat the P-whackers out of him," or something like that, Then it wouldn't have been bear down Jim. It would have been beat the P-whackers out of him, Jim. Or beat the P-whackers out of him, Arizona.
Wow.
And that was 100 years. And did a history of Tucson radio for OLLI, which is Osher Lifelong Learning at the University of Arizona. And so I had to study what the history of radio was, because I didn't know what it was like back then and who started and everything. And that's when I discovered the first radio station in Tucson was in 1926. And Tucson in those days, and that's exactly 100 years. So I thought, what a perfect thing to go out and tell people about Arizona, Tucson radio. And this was 100 years ago. And it was the first radio station, and people had been experimenting a little bit. Maybe they'd put a radio station on for, a couple of weeks, and there'd be a lot of young kids, that would read Popular Mechanics magazine, here, build your own radio station, that type of thing. But in 1926, the Tucson Daily Citizen newspaper decided to have a radio station. They figured this would be a perfect thing to add to our newspaper, which was delivered every day for a nickel to your home, along with the Arizona Daily Star, was also the other newspaper in town. But they decided they were going to do it, and so they built a radio station. It was a 100-watt radio station, which is very low wattage. The lowest wattage they have now is 250 watts, but this was very, very small radio station. It was at 1230 on the dial, and it wasn't on all the time. In other words, it was just on part of the time. They promoted the radio station in the newspaper, and there's a there's a column here. It says radio neighborliness. It says, the radio station, it should be understood, is not a money-making enterprise. Listeners are no doubt familiar with the methods of maintenance of radio service by newspapers. Music programs are sometimes put on the air by merchants who consider themselves repaid by the publicity and the goodwill created. So in other words, they didn't think it was a money-making enterprise. Isn't that which for them, I don't think it turned out to be, because they owned it. So they would have a couple programs on, and I have some of the schedules here, and it's really kind of interesting to see what programs they had on. Like here they got, KGAR, those were the call letters of the radio station, and on Wednesday at 12 to 12:30, news bulletins and station return and election returns. Apparently there was an election on Tuesday, and then from 6 to 9 p.m., news bulletins plus Miss Georgia Haley, who will perform singing, and then there will be a group by another musical group of some kind. They didn't realize in those days that they could actually play records. So everything they had on the air was actually a live musical group. It was so interesting. They hadn't thought about playing records yet. Wow. So they wouldn't be on 24 hours or 12 hours or even 8 hours. They'd maybe on 3 or 4 hours in a day.
Isn't that?
And Tucson was a very small place, and it was only 25,000 people. The eastern limit was Campbell Avenue. This eastern city limit was Campbell Avenue, and that was it.
Can you imagine?
And so they kept on the air for a year and a half, and they decided to get out of the business, and they sold it to a car service station. Not a car seller, but a car service station where they provided gas and tires for cars. And they're the company, the Tucson Motor Service Company, that owned that radio station for about the next 10 years until somebody came in and bought it. Can you imagine that?
Smokes.
So they were sold to a gas station, basically.
My gosh.
So they kept on the air, and in 1929, the second radio station came on, which would become KVOA, which was going to eventually be at 1290 on the dial. And then there were national networks that came along. And so in the late 20s, you had CBS and NBC. KGAR became CBS, and the other station, KVOA, became NBC. And so then they started playing all these dramatic shows and comedies and all that sort of thing. And people would sit around the living room, around their radio, and they would watch the radio. They would look at the radio and listen to all these performances. You know, there wasn't anything to see, so it would be whatever their imagination was. And it was really important during World War II. That's the only way they got their news bulletins. And of course, we had the Depression then shortly after that. And FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, would speak, and he would do his fireside chats, you know. And that was really a big part of his administration, to calm the people down and realize things were going to be better. And so radio played a really important factor in this thing. Oh, gosh. And then it went along like that until around 1950, when the second phase of radio came along. 1950, dramatic. The advent of this new thing, a box with pictures on it, a thing called television. Wow. Now you not only could hear, but you could see, you know. And the second thing that came along at the same time was a guy named Elvis Presley. So you had the advent of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, the start of Top 40 radio. And that was a big thing for about another 25 years. And that was AM radio. And then at the end of that time was the beginning of FM radio becoming hugely popular, when cars started putting FM radios in the cars. And then the AM radio dial was kind of shut off to the side, and everybody that liked music, and which was the number one product of radio was music, then they would listen to the FM side. Well, what was left for the AM side? The quality wasn't that good, but voice was okay. So then you'd have a lot of news programs and all that sort of thing. And at the same time, they changed the rules. You know, we used to have rules about equal time and the fairness doctrine. So if you had a half-hour show for the Democrats, you would have to have a half-hour show for the Republicans. Yeah. They threw that all out the window and said, hey, just go ahead and do what you want to do. Okay, so the Republicans came out and they said, oh, we're going to do this. Okay, so they started having their talk shows and their hosts and everything, and they were huge successes. And the old angry white guys used to love to listen to this stuff. Rush Limbaugh, he was the king of that kind of radio. And a bunch of others came along. And so then the Democrats tried it. Didn't work. Just didn't work. The Democrats didn't want to sit around and listen to the radio. It's just one of those things that it worked for the Republicans. It did not work for the Democrats. Okay. So then as we got into the year 2000, then everything was changed, because then all of a sudden you had the internet, and you had new rules regarding ownership of stations. There was a time when you had ownership of stations where you could only own 7 AM, 7 FM, and 7 television stations per corporation or per entity. Well, now the FCC said you can own as many as you want. Go ahead, And so then you had these major corporations buying all these radio stations in all these markets. So you would have one company that would own six radio stations in Tucson, for example. And so you wouldn't have to have 6 separate sets of employees. You could have just one set of employees, and all of a sudden, with satellite radio and everything else, you wouldn't need to have you wouldn't need to have 8 people say, here's Taylor Swift's latest record. If you had one guy say it for all of your stations, why pay all those people when you could do that? So you lost a lot of local radio with that.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the dramatic change. Plus, at right now, what's going on is what you're doing right here with the podcast. You're competing with the radio stations. You are, and people are listening to you as opposed to listening to a radio station right now. And considering the fact that there are actually 1 million podcasts out there, can you imagine the competitive nature of radio is very, very difficult. And where we had 2 stations at one time in Tucson, now, do you know how many radio stations are in Tucson?
No.
Not counting Nogales or Sierra Vista or anything, 69 radio stations you can get on the dial.
Just in Tucson?
Just in Tucson alone, that are over the air that you can get with your radio. Most of them are FM, few of them are AM, but it's a total of 69 in that area. It's phenomenal. Okay.
That's amazing.
So you've got those 69 stations, plus you've got all the podcasts, plus you've got the radio coming from the satellite. You've got XM and XM Sirius radio with all the channels there, which are competitive. Plus you've got all the channels that not only, like, for example, you're on Spotify and all those various services. Well, they also have all these music services that are competing. So the competition for your ears is absolutely enormous. What a dramatic change from that one little old radio station back in 1926 to now, for your ears, we're talking millions virtually. Incredible, isn't it?
It is. And you know what? That's a perfect place to take a break. And when we come back, I want to hear the story about you and radio. So we'll be right back. We've done more than 80 episodes now. Our latest innovation for bringing you an even fresher, more interesting show is the Road Trip Kit. Tom Heidinger never stops figuring out how to do things. So now I can pick up 2 sturdy cases, head off in the Bronco Sport for parts unlimited. I guess the only limit to me is the state borders, because I want Arizona stories. But we can record in a vineyard, downtown, Route 66, you name it. Even more fun. We are back with Ray Lindstrom, who was I'm not going to say pivotal part of early radio in Tucson.
I don't think I was very pivotal.
But I think you were a fantastic, amazing, enterprising young man. You did something nobody could have dreamed doing. So first of all, you and Bert, start with that.
Well, Bert and I, we wanted to be in radio, of course, and I told you our first adventure in radio was at the FM station. And then when we were seniors in high school, we decided we wanted to start a record company, and that's when we started Zoom Records. And our number one group was Pete Ronstadt and the Night Beats. I don't know if you know who Pete Ronstadt was. He was police chief, but his little sister, she would be there when we would do rehearsals, and we would tell her, "Get lost, kid. This is serious business, right?"
And we're talking
whatever happened to Linda anyway? Did she?
Isn't that something?
Yeah, that was something. But anyway, we did that, and we had several groups, and we made records, and they became hits in certain markets. One of our records became a big hit in Pittsburgh, and it's on one of their compilation albums, Pittsburgh's Greatest Hits, as a matter of fact. And we did that, and then we all went away to college, and everything was different. But while I was in high school, I had one other job that I wanted to tell you about, and that was I got a job at KTUC Radio. At 12 noon, they had a show called The Courteous Driver Show. And I was on that. They asked me if I wanted to do it. Somebody there knew my mother, and my mother told them that I was real interested in radio, and if there was ever an opening, to talk to your son. So they talked to me and asked me if I would. So in high school, I left for lunch every day, and I went down, and I would go with a police officer, and we would go try to find a courteous driver, okay? And so the cop would stop the driver, and then I would interview the driver and give him some prizes, and that was the whole show. It was like a 5-minute show, sponsored by an insurance company, okay? So the first time we ever went out was how are you ever going to find a courteous driver? I mean, you could look all day to find a courteous driver. However, we finally found the solution to that was the Broadway tunnel, where 2 lanes turned into one, and one person allowed the next person to go through, and then that person was the courteous driver of the day. We did that every day.
You could just
after
pluck
that.
Pluck them out.
So I would do that, and I would
funny.
interview the guy, and I would give him some prizes. So anyway, that went on for a few weeks, and here I am. I finally got my first job in AM radio. I actually got paid, and it was really wonderful and everything. And one day, after I had come, and I would deliver the tape to the station, and then they would play it because we didn't have any facilities to do remote broadcast, needless to say. Sure. So I would make a tape. So I brought the tape back to the station one day, and the general manager happened to be there, and he said, "Oh, Ray, who'd you get today for your courteous driver?" And I said, "Whoa, I got this real nice Negro gentleman." And that was the parlance of the day. Mm-hmm. And he all of a sudden, his face turned red. He said, "What'd you give him for a gift?" And I said, "Well, I gave him a dinner for 2 at Mama Louise's Italian restaurant." He said, "You got to call them and get them back. They don't serve." And then he used the N-word. Oh, and I was shocked. I had never heard anything like this before. This is not Mississippi. I live in Tucson, Arizona. What are you, crazy? Oh. And here, this is this old man who's my boss. The general manager says, "You got to call him back." He says, "Give him some records or something." I said, "Oh, I can't do that." He says, "You got to. It's your job." I says, "I'm not going to call him back and ask him to give me the dinner tickets back." "Well, you have to." I said, "I can't do it," and I just walked out the door, and that was the end of my career at that radio station. Now, it must be noted that KTUC is a different radio station, different owners. Mama Louise's Italian restaurant is still in business, but they have different owners, different policy and everything, so I don't want to say anything bad about them. But I learned something that day, and I was brought up in an atmosphere of everybody was equal. My dad always said, everybody's equal regardless of race, creed, or color, and I was shocked that day to discover, first time I discovered that Tucson was like that. I never really understood that, But anyway, I got a job in television, and I was at Channel 9 as an announcer when I was 18 years old for a while, and over a year, and that was great. And then I was at a radio station. I got my first job, full-time job in radio at KAIR Radio as the all-night disc jockey from midnight to 6 a.m. in a station that was trying to be a country.
That's a long shift.
Oh, it's a long shift, especially when you have no listeners. I would have contests and nobody would call in. I'd have to make up names of winners. Well, I suffered for a little while, going from station to station in Tucson. But, you get improve and you get a little better and better and everything. And finally, I made it to the number 1 station in Tucson, which was KTKT. And I was hired by Frank Khalil, who was the number 1 disc jockey in town. There were 11 radio stations in that time, and KTKT was number 1. We played the top 40 tunes. And the top 40 was, it was. People say, well, you were at the rock station. Well, it was whatever was popular in those days. It could be the Singing Nun. It could be Percy Faith and his orchestra. It could be the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Elvis, Leslie Gore. If it was popular, you played it. Didn't make any difference what it was. That was the whole deal. And we had half of the audience of all the stations in town. It was a great radio station. Wow. But there were a couple things that I remember about being there. They were kind of historic in my mind. One was on November 22nd, 1963, and I was listening to the radio, and I heard Lloyd Couch, our news director, interrupt a commercial. Well, he never interrupted a commercial for a news bulletin when he said that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. And I thought, wow, that's really incredible. And so I went down to the radio station right away because that's where, if you worked in radio, you wanted to be there. And the management, they were sitting around in the production room trying to figure out what to do. Do we continue with our same format of playing the popular tunes? Do we switch format? Do we play patriotic music? Well, it was voted to play until the funeral of JFK. It was voted to play nothing but patriotic music. So Jerry Stowe, the program director, he goes down to Ruby Tom's Records to buy patriotic music. He comes back with a couple of record albums with like 6 songs on, America, My Country 'Tis of Thee, America the Beautiful, the Star Spangled Banner, Columbia, Gem of the Ocean, and that's about it. So for 3 days, this number one top 40 station played nothing but patriotic music. And if you were sad about JFK being shot, if you listened to our station, you'd really be sad because, boy, it was awful. Now, and you wonder what it would be like today if the same thing happened. Would stations change their format? What would they do? You just don't know. But back in 1963, that's what we did.
Fascinating.
And there was one other thing that I remember, and this was in 1964. Excuse me, it was in 1964, and Bob Dylan had his first record come out, and it was called Like a Rolling Stone. And so on Thursday night, all the disc jockeys would get together with the program director and with Johnny Barker, who had a record counter at Woolworth's downtown. We all get together, and we decide what records to play the following week. And so...
Wow.
So Jerry Stowe played Rolling Stone and said, this is a big hit, starting to break out in all the markets. And another guy says, you can't play that. The guy's a commie, he lives in New York. Another guy says, I've heard of him. I don't know about him. We can't play that kind of music. And Johnny Barker says, geez, he said, I was in World War II. He says, I got to tell you, he says, if you don't play it, it's like Hitler's book burning. And there was a big argument about whether or not to play Bob Dylan in 1964. Well, we eventually did play it, okay?
All right. Striking a blow for freedom of speech.
Right. That's right.
Oh
And then, of course, we had that big English wave, and that actually started in '64 also with the Beatles came out. And I am proud to say that I was the first person to play a Beatles record in Tucson.
No.
And I did that. Yes,
I've known you all these years, and I never knew that.
I wasn't even aware of that fact until the other day. I was talking to Chris. Do you know who Chris O'Dell is? She worked for the Beatles, and she has a movie out. She grew up in Tucson, and she told me she first heard the Beatles on my show, and she ended up working for the Beatles in London in their offices there. And I said, my gosh, that's right. I would have been the first one because I played the Top 40 show on Saturday. And that's where we introduced all the new records, and that's where I introduced the Beatles. I Want to Hold Your Hand, number one.
I was just going to ask, do you remember which song it was?
And do you know they played that record at Taylor Swift's wedding?
No.
Paul McCartney sang I Want to Hold Your Hand at Taylor Swift's wedding the other day. Isn't that incredible?
Wow, talk about what's the word I want? My gosh, to still be relevant.
Right. I know.
So that was 64?
That was 64. In 1965, my career in Tucson ended, and I moved to Phoenix to the sister station, KRUX in Phoenix, and I was a disc jockey and a salesman, and then I went into television and then started my own advertising agency and got in the infomercial business and just did a lot of other things too. But that first bit of radio, we all just wanted to be disc jockeys, and we did.
Well, you didn't go into infomercials. You created infomercials.
Well, that's true.
There's a difference.
I say modestly, yes.
No, that's.
Well, that's what I'm known for is doing the first infomercials. That's right. Yeah, that was in 1985, and it was just when things were changing and the cable television came along and the rules about half-hour television shows all these rules were changing. We were talking about the rules change with radio and all that sort of thing, and there were a lot of rules change. There used to be rules that said you couldn't have just half-hour shows selling things. Yeah.
Oh, selling things. Okay.
Couldn't do that. All of a sudden, the rules were changed, and we could have half-hour shows selling those. So whenever anybody sees all that junk late at night on television that sold things you don't need for high prices, you can say, I know the guy that started that. You can blame me for it.
I am 1 degree of separation The start of infomercials. But it paid off like crazy, didn't it?
It was very good, yes. It was very good. Nobody had seen that sort of thing before, and they just enjoyed watching it just like a regular program, you bet.
Yeah. That's fun.
Well, it's been a great ride, and everything is just so dramatically changed. And what's changed is what you're doing. What you are doing here is what has changed the landscape. So you were in television in
That's
Phoenix. True. And you were in television in Tucson.
Yeah.
And now, the television stations are struggling. The radio stations are struggling because what you're doing right here, this is the new media.
And what's a little bit unfortunate about this, and I'm right in the trough of it. We have become more and more and more bifurcated, more specialized, more niche, and supposedly the best podcasts are niche. Well, I don't do the United States. I do Celebrating Arizona.
Right.
So I'm leaving out 49 states. But on the other hand, we all are interested in what we're interested in, and I guess that's been true forever.
Right.
So I don't know. I want to hear the story about when you and Renee were in Europe.
Which time was that?
The time that you heard the Zoom record.
Oh my gosh, yeah. This was in 1989, and I was in Berlin, Germany, and the wall had just come down, and so we just happened to be there, and the people are there, and they got their hammers, and they're beating the wall, and they're taking things off the wall, and so there were all these record stores, and I thought, gee, that's kind of interesting, and now there are no CDs yet. I don't think there were CDs yet. Maybe there were, but the record stores were big and they were selling albums. And so I go in there and I started looking at these old albums, and an album is called Old American Rock and Roll. And I look there, they've got my records on there. Here's Scandal by King Rock and the Knights, or Lonesome Road Rock by Pete Ronstadt and the Nightbeats. They just stole my records, and they put them on their compilation albums of old American rock and roll. And I was shocked. So Renee said the whole time we were in Berlin, all you did was spend all your time in the record stores. And I found about 5 albums with our records on from this stuff that I had done when I was 17 years old in high school. They were still there.
Wow.
It was really amazing. And this is, the internet has brought a new phase to this whole thing, because all those records that we did back then, they're all on the internet. Everybody can enjoy them. They're on Spotify. They're on Apple iTunes. They're on YouTube. They're everywhere.
Isn't that marvelous?
They're everywhere.
So how would I find them? Would I look up Zoom Records?
No, you just if you can look up Zoom Records,
okay.
Or you can just if you know the name of the record, you could put Pete Ronstadt and the Nightbeats in there, and you'll find them. A lot of times I have Alexa at home, and I will say, Alexa, I say, Alexa, I want to hear the podcast Celebrating Arizona. You come right up. I say, Alexa, play Lonesome Road Rock by Pete Ronstadt and the Nightbeats. Comes right up. Whatever I want, it's there. Do I want Lisa? Do I want Pete? They're there.
The world is an amazing place.
It is.
It truly is.
Yes.
That's fun. So is Tucson celebrating the centennial of radio in any way?
That's an interesting question. I am doing as much as I can to promote the fact that this is the 100th anniversary of radio in Tucson. And I've been on radio a little bit, the few radio stations that are still around where I can actually go on in somebody's program. And I do that, and I give talks to various groups. And I will be giving a lecture at Osher Lifelong Learning in both Phoenix and Green Valley about the history of radio, and it's like an hour-and-a-half thing. I do that.
Do you have any idea what month that is?
I don't know. I'm not on the schedule specifically yet, but that'll be there, and so I'll do that. And I'm giving at La Posada, the new resort in Tucson, in Oro Valley, the new assisted living resort. I'll be giving a talk on September 15th there about the history of radio, because I want people to know about this,
Yes.
And whether or not anybody's really interested in it, I don't know, but I am. Because this is what I come out of. And this is your ancestry was your dad in radio,
Yeah.
and your dad was in radio before he was in television.
And he wanted to make the big market because he was in Flagstaff at KGPH, being
Right.
a little market, and they hired him in Phoenix, and he moved his new bride to Phoenix, and he's all excited. And only then did he find out that they had just promoted the heck out of their DJ, Johnny Dark, who left. So Larry Schnebly was never on the radio in Phoenix. Johnny Dark was on the radio in Phoenix.
Do you know? And I discovered that as in a newspaper column, and it said Larry Schnebly, also known as Johnny Dark, and it said and his wife and his wife Lee, who is also on the radio, and they mentioned KCNA here in Tucson, which was a radio station that she was on.
I didn't know
Your
she was
mom.
on a station in Tucson.
Yes, it said KCNA, and then it mentioned another radio station which I wasn't familiar with.
KGPH was where she started in Flagstaff.
Maybe that was the other radio
Because
station.
Larry was her engineer, and that's
Right.
how they met.
Right, that's
But
right.
I didn't know she had a Tucson show.
Yeah, well, it said that in the column in the Arizona Republic. I should have copied that for you.
For heaven's
Yeah,
sake.
I know.
That's amazing. I love that I can have known you this long and still be learning things.
Well, I tell you, it's been a great ride, and you know, I loved being in radio and television, and it was so much fun to go. You know, you just enjoyed it so much going to the radio station, just spending time there, being with the people in the radio. I mean, they were all interesting people, and going to the television station. You know, even when you weren't working or you weren't on the clock, you loved being there, just spending time there, and helping out and watching what people did in the studio and setting up props and all that sort of thing. And when you were gone, you listened to it on the radio, and you were part of it. It was such an exciting thing to be.
It was so new and so energetic.
It was.
Then.
It was just exciting. You just enjoyed every bit of it.
And I'm glad you were there for that.
It was really something special.
Yeah.
Something special. It really was.
So are you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. It really was a pleasure to be on your show. Remember, just ask Alexa. She'll tell you. She'll let you listen to Lisa whenever you want to.
We'd really like to hear from you about anything this show led you to think about. Write to us at celebratingaz.com. The wizard behind making a conversation into a podcast is Tom Heidinger. The music comes from Daniel Blatney. And I'm Dana Cooper.
Look down that lonesome road before you travel on. Look up, and meet your maker, for Gabriel that blows his horn. Well, weary told in such a road, traveling down that lonesome road. Look down that lonesome road before you travel on. Before Gabriel